Hi, Misha here, and I'm recording this and publishing this in March of 2024, which is the 10-year anniversary, 1 decade, since the beginning of sanctions against Russia because of the events in Crimea back when, and of course they've only tightened over time. And these would culminate with talks in June. We know it was going into effect and going into full effect in July of that year, of essentially sanctioning everything to do with Kalashnikov Concern, and therefore no one could import Saigas, parts, or do business with them. And it wasn't, of course, just an American sanction. America joined Canada, Britain, and most of Western Europe and all of that too. Not getting into the politics, but I wanted to talk about the Saiga line because these couple came around and it seemed like a good time and a good topic. Why not? Here we have quite an early Saiga 7.62 by 39 rifle import. And then we have a slightly later Saiga 12 import here, although different importer. And these are probably the most popular Saigas in this configuration with the Monte Carlo stock. A lot to be said here, and maybe some who are newer to the AK market don't understand what the big deal was, why we were so excited to get these guns as sporterized as they are, why it was kind of a game changer and led to some really great things for over a decade. So we're going to go over the import history, the design, and a little bit about what you could do if you wanted to make these look more like a AKM or AK-74, what have you, the pros and cons. So hey, why not? We like AK talk around here, and if you do too, please do like, share, and subscribe, and do please comment. And also, if you'd like to help support us, check out the link to Patreon. With that, let's go back to the 80s, early 90s. In the pre-ban era, and by that we mean pre-March of 1989 with the Bush executive order, there were absolutely no Russian AK imports. In fact, AK imports were pretty restrictive. Mostly you saw Chinese, some Hungarian, and if you wanted the closest thing to Russian on a stamped receiver, this was what you had. The Egyptian Mahdi. And they promoted that very heavily with certificates and everything. And they even today remain some of the closest to AKM spec that you can find. 7.62 by 39, 16 1/4 inch barrel, standard double stack magwell, standard furniture, pistol grip, paint over phosphate finish. The gloopy finish on a Mahdi is actually very close to the gloopy finish found on a Russian military AKM. And flipping them over. If you wanted a milled AK that looked like a Russian, China did offer for a few years the famous Polytech Legend, the AK-47S. But that was really it. Frankly, we had no AK-74 clones or copies available to us. And you'll notice, of course, these look very different. Not just the furniture, but 45-degree gas block versus 90. This has the different style of scope rail. This has not at all. Yeah, we'll get into all that. But that's because the Saigas were not based on the AKM or even AK-74, but rather the new AK Century series, the AK-100 series as it's nicknamed here. Saiga is the one true authorized, authentic Kalashnikov to come into the USA. Why is that? Not only was the Izhevsk Machine plant or factory, the original manufacturer of the AK Type 3, AK-47, and AKM. It was also where Mikhail Kalashnikov himself worked for decades, even into the 1990s in some capacity. There would also be the Izhevsk Mechanical Plant, because this is a city, and of course World War II, Soviets, it's a thing. We're not going to get into it. I'm just mentioning that here and now because it's somewhat relevant. Anyway, after World War II, the Great Patriotic War, Izhevsk Machine would start a hunting, sporting civilian line. Not only is hunting a sport in Russia, honestly defending oneself against wildlife, wolves, bears, whatever, is actually important. And in the 1970s, the very first semi-automatic only civilian Saigas would appear, chambered for 5.6 by 39. I've seen it called .220. And these would be made by Izhevsk Machine, which started using the name Izhmash at this time, at least in some capacity. But this line was not successful for various reasons. The Cold War still raging on, and in the 80s, there was no way Russian guns were getting exported to America or imported into America. The best you could do would be adjacent nations like Hungary, Yugoslavia, as we saw, Egypt. That's really the best you could do. And of course, China was on good terms with America then, so there we go. So none of these were coming in. But with the fall of the USSR, the Warsaw Pact, and all that, the communist bloc, Izhevsk Machine would become Izhmash around 1991, give or take, and Izhevsk Mechanical would become Izhmek. And so you'll see different things. There also will be the Bakel name, which was used under the same Izhmash thing, but that was more their hunting line, target line in some cases. Izhmash being the name they use for kind of civilian sporting guns and what have you. So that gets us to the end of the USSR, and they needed money, and that's why they revived the semi-automatic Kalashnikov-based line here. As I'm sure you know, Saiga is a type of wildlife in Russia. It's a type of antelope around the mountains. And that makes sense because of the hunting purpose. So these were not originally made explicitly for the Western market. But former communist nations very quickly realized, you know what? North America, specifically the USA, there's money. We can make money. We need money. It's a thing. So very quickly, the relationships were established, and Saigas would start coming into the U.S. And the first importer would actually be Big Bear Arms down in Texas. Now, their guns are dated as early as 93. I'm not sure if they actually made it into the U.S. by 93 or 94, but that was around the same time period as a lot of the other kind of early Kalashnikov types. For example, right around the same time period, we had the very first Bulgarian arsenals. Circle 10 guns. Here's an SA-93 in its original import form. These are the early days. Romanian guns would not start appearing until 1997, as it were, and we'd have to wait quite a bit longer for Polish, although Hungarian, boom, they were in there. The SA-85 had come in the pre-ban era, and would continue in the post-ban, as would Mahdi's. I wanted to bring this out to really show you something, though. This is the post-89 ban. No one knows really what is and isn't allowed, what can and can't be done. And we look at this arsenal, no threaded barrel, no cleaning rod, which is kind of funny they deleted that. But we have standard handguards, at least standard ones will fit. Of course, this is milled receiver, standard sights. Even though we have a thumbhole stock, this is a standard square back receiver. Yes, you did need to install the lower tang, but that was easy enough. But you also notice we have a standard mag in this, and we don't up here. Flipping these over, like I said, standard mag well in the arsenal. This would be allowed up until 1998. And the Saiga might at first look standard. It is double stack. But it lacks a bullet guide. Also, the mag catch is higher versus the Arsenal, which has a standard mag catch. There's more of a gap there. Here are the mags. Standard AK catch and rear. Here is the Russian mag. This is thinner, and we have this larger here, and the front has a lip. Here they are together. Hopefully I can get it on video just to show you the difference in the front. So the rear is different, slimmer on the Saiga mag versus standard, and then it's reversed in the front. Larger lug on the Saiga, smaller on the standard, but that's because also the front is different. This essentially acts as a bullet guide in the mag versus here, and that's to keep rounds from diving into the chamber, because like I said, these were originally made as sporting guns in Russia, and they had and still have a maximum allowed limit of 10 rounds for civilian guns. So that's what we have here, even though it's a double stack. There are ways to get around that, of course, but it's just interesting to kind of compare. The other things like the Monte Carlo stock, could they have done a thumbhole stock? Yes, and later on they would for the Saigas, but they're really playing it safe here with these early imports. Again, Big Bear was the first. Of all things, second in 1994 would be B West. They would bring some in. And the early guns, we had two styles, two configurations. The 7.62x39 classic Saiga, but the early ones had a 20-inch barrel, or 20.5 as some sources say. This has a 16 1/4 standard length. And the 410. I don't know if Big Bear imported 410s, I would assume so, but I know B West did. And that would sometimes be called as the Cossack in Russia. And these would be early 410s. And, for that matter, the early 7.62s. For example, they lack the bolt holdback device here. Manual as it is. Some people hate these. I kind of like them. I find them useful. Either way, they didn't have those, and the shotguns did not have the sliding cover. We'll get to that. And they had an early style gas system. These were very new in Russia. The earliest ones we see in America have 93 dated trunnions. And slab side receivers without the dimples. On the other hand, for better or worse, some of the earlier ones had a somewhat heavier profile barrel. When we start doing comparisons, maybe you can tell a little more. They also, while it seems to be a standard rear sight, it's only adjustable out to 300 meters, at least markings, which is frankly probably more realistic for this gun anyway. Now there's a screw under the handguard here to hold it on. And there's this flat rivet here on the trunnion. Some think that was actually done for the Saiga Sporter, but actually no, this is part of the AK-100 series. It's a bump rivet to aid in bolt rotation and closure, and it's also replaceable in case it wears. And then with the 100 series, the AK-74M, a scope rail was made standard, as was this smooth top cover, which is actually a little bit heavier. But then they also moved the trigger group to the rear. Squared receiver, still a standard rear top tang. There's a bit of a thing on the bottom, but of course when you pop the trigger guard off, that would go away. Standard mag catch, except for it's higher. And standard safety. This is not an AK-47, AKM, AK-74. This is a Saiga, but it uses the Kalashnikov operating system. Popping one apart real quick shows that. And of course they come apart like a standard Kalashnikov. We have a recoil guide spring, top cover, bolt group. Interestingly, this one does have the trip here. Non-spring-loaded firing pin on this one. Standard AK bolt. This is the standard unfluted piston head for this series. Serials do match. Inside here, note how the mag comes up and serves as the bullet guide, getting that directed into the chamber. And then note how our trigger is further back than it normally would be. Hammer's still up here, but our trigger is way back here at this linkage. Yeah. So we had Big Bear and B West, but they would only import to roughly 1995. This gun is marked EAA, European American Armory. They were our next major importer, although there were several small ones that popped up in and out, just like with the Arsenals. And they were really the first ones to bring the Saiga to the market in a big way, and the first time I was ever aware of these. Talks with Izhmash, the name that Izhevsk Machine was using in the 90s, would begin with EAA in 1999, and by 2002 these were on the American market, although some sources say 2001 is when they hit. Either way, if you look at the production trunnion dates, some of them are 2000, 2001, 2002, but there are some earlier ones, 93, 94, 95 dates. I would assume these were guns that were made, or at least receivers that were made, but didn't get exported for one reason or another. Again, early days, the importation was kind of hit or miss, but EAA really brought these in and really showed off the line, and it would be around 2001, 2002 when I would first see these in stores. I remember it was still during the federal assault weapons ban, which was from 94 to 2004. And they would further expand the line. Remember, at this point, we're only at 7.62, 39, and 410. But around 1997, Izhmash would expand the line by introducing a new, more reinforced receiver and just more calibers in general. So now we can bring the Saiga 12 back out. I wouldn't call this an RPK receiver. It's not really bulged. It's got a little bit of a bulge, but it does take inspiration from that, going to a thicker stamping. Now, some even call this a 1.1 mil receiver. That's fine, 1.0, 1.1. Well, this would be about a 1.4, 1.5, allowing for 12 gauge. It would also allow for 308, 7.62 NATO. And we would see 223 appear, 5.56 NATO, around the turn of the millennium. And of course, 20 gauge would be in the mix. By this point, we've got a line going. And this is when I first ran into these. The funny thing is, when I went to the stores, I didn't see the 12 gauge. I saw 7.62 by 39s. I saw 5.56s, a little bit less. And I saw 410s. If memory serves, they were the cheapest of them by just a teensy hair. 20 gauge, they were there. And 308s were kind of the most expensive. How much were they? Well, that also explains why I didn't see a lot of Saiga 12s back in 2002 or so. Flipping these over, you can note the sliding cover here. That was an introduction to the shotguns. Also the spring-loaded retainer and the 2-position gas regulator, also the bead front sight and fixed notch rear. Some shotguns would have rams. Anyway, cost. These were the first Russian-built AK-inspired guns ever in America. That's why we didn't... We recognized they were not military style. They were sporter. But keep in mind, this was still during the federal assault weapons ban. We couldn't have folding stocks, bayonet lugs, threaded barrels, anyway. So it was just cool to get something Russian and new. The only Russians you could get at that time were some parts kits, and those were usually well-used, often mismatched kits out of Israel that were considered PLO guns, which are cool, but this is a true Russian, and it was their current style. The AK-100. Of course, this would be based on the AK-103 loosely. This gun, back in the day, was around $170 retail in a store, give or take a few bucks. And like I said, I think the 410 was slightly cheaper at $160. The 223 was slightly more. The 20 gauge was slightly more. And the 308, that was the big boy. It was over $200. 210, 220, somewhere in that ballpark. And in today's money, it still sounds good. For example, like I said, this would be about 170. In today's money, that would still be under $400. Not bad, really. About $350, give or take your tax. But that's also why the Saiga 12 wasn't carried. This was one of the very first magazine-fed 12-gauge shotguns on the American market. And I asked the store, they're in the catalog, why don't you have them? Money. Original retail price was around $320. Some places said $350. And in today's money, you're looking at about $550 to $600. I kind of point this out because that's kind of in keeping with some of the Chinese clones and copies you run into. But yeah, that kind of kept the 12 gauge from being as successful. Early on, this was the winner for the most part, even if it took doofy mags. And EAA would import the line for a few years, 2005, 2006. And at that time, Russian-American Armory would step into the game too. And you started seeing RAA marked guns. So for a while there was EAA and RAA. And those were the Saigas. And of course, at the end of 2004, the federal assault weapons ban was lifted or expired at sunset, which meant converting became much more attractive. And then certain U.S. companies like Tromix popped up. Carolina Shooter Supply is another one that popped up later. They really tailored into the Saiga conversion market because EAA and then RAA had wide expansion. Izhmash had a huge production facility. Even today, they make over 90% of their guns in Russia. So they could turn them out as quick as they could buy them, and they were priced to move. Anyone could afford these. They could afford any gun. Even back then, they were remarkably cheap. But of course, if you wanted to convert one, the price would quickly rise. And in the early days, they were all do-it-yourself conversions. And sometimes you would just convert for a pistol grip and a magwell. Now, I can't give instructions on how to do it, YouTube, but we've already kind of talked about it. If you want to put a pistol grip on, you need to pop this, move your trigger group forward. There is the plate there. Re-rivet, bada boom, bada bang, put your thing in. Then you need to fill in some holes. Fun fact, these pivot pins are actually captive, like they're flared out. You can't just drive them out as standard. So you need a punch. Once you did that, you could put on a standard stock pretty easily, and then a pistol grip. You would need to get a few more rivets and change this up a bit here with the trigger guard and mag catch, but you could do it, and then you could put that on. And as for the magwell, the two things you need to do, well, first, you can just file down or replace the mag catch, and that will let a standard mag fit. You can even modify the mag. Someone did this, not me, by shaving down the rear lug of this Pro Mag here. The front lug, of course, is still small, but if you do that, it will go in. Sorry, I banged YouTube here. I can't actually put it in on camera, but here it is in. You can see the mag catch is fully locked forward. And that worked for some people. They claimed they had no problems with feeding, but there's that bullet guide issue. Popping the top again, if you look in here the way the mag sits, there's a gap. You go straight from the mag into this area, and what can happen is a round can hang up on the edge of the chamber face. There isn't a guide there to bump it up and get it at the right angle. So part of it could just be ammo dependent, or the mag. This is a Pro Mag, so it wouldn't feed reliably anyway, but there is this gulf, this gap in there. So you take your chances. If you try to do it that way, you're not going to get awesome reliability. And here's the Russian mag back in. See that jump there that keeps your tapered bullet angled properly where it'll shoot into the chamber correctly. Good news is installing a bullet guide is very easy. In fact, some people use soda cans. You just need something there to bump it up. And for example, like I said, Carolina Shooter Supplies sells a kit. You can do it quick and easy by just kind of gluing it in, a little bit less easy by using a screw to attach it, or you could do it properly with a rivet. So something you need to do there. Now, converting the front end. That gets us to one of the benefits of earlier imports like the EAA. For this next thing, I guess I'll have to bring out my Vepr RPK, since I don't have a Saiga with this. But around 2008, give or take, Izhmash was under financial strain. This would actually ultimately lead to reorganization and new management a few years later. But they were also trying to increase production for the U.S. market. And they would do this for their military guns as well. But they would go from the gas block front sight being traditionally pinned on, like on other Kalashnikovs, to dimpled on. So basically just slide it on and dimple it on to the barrel there. Doot, doot, and doot. You see it on this Vepr. Save time, save energy. This one's not dimpled up here because you need to be able to remove the front sight base to get to your bipod if it needs replacing on an RPK. And that's the problem. Once they're dimpled on, they're more or less permanent. So if you want to remove your gas block or front sight on the Saiga, you're probably going to destroy the piece itself. And if you're not careful, you could even do damage to the side of your barrel or even drill through your barrel for some people that got a little too zealous. That meant earlier guns like this were easier to put proper barrel hardware on because you could just unpin it. Don't get me wrong, you still would need a press and some other things. It's not easy. That's why a lot of your conversions leave the front end alone. So unless you really want a military look, most conversions would just stop at the rear and magazine. Doing a front end conversion is a bit much, and after the dimple fit devices, well, yeah. Ironically, around this time, prices would go up too because, well, the economy but also desirability would go up. The secret was out. By 2007, 2008, the Saiga was actually gaining quite a bit of popularity, including finally the 12 gauge. Yeah, 2002 to 2008 was the era for the rifle to shine. But from that point on, the shotgun, the Saiga 12, would be what people thought of when you said the word Saiga in America. So why is that? Well, for one, even though the rear trigger stock would need conversion just like a rifle, the magwell did not. This is, of course, a single stack because, 12 gauge, guys, 76 millimeter 3-inch Magnum, but also 2 3/4. Nice to have an adjustable gas system. This is the standard 5-round mag they would ship with. And this is the extended 8-round mag that would be used by law enforcement and military. And they're the same. It goes right in. It's actually also very nice having the manual hold open for the 12 gauge because of how the shells stick out the top when fully loaded. So yeah, of course, early on the problem was getting the 8-round mags. Of course, that would be resolved later. Shoot, getting spare 5s was a little problematic sometimes. So that already made them attractive, which did obviously raise the price. If they thought 320 was high, by this time, 2008, 2009, the price was hitting 400, 450. There was a little election that year too that's actually very relevant to the Saiga, but that propelled any kind of military-ish shotgun. And by that point, there was a whole cottage industry converting these because you could put folding stocks on them now. I even saw bayonet adapters you could put on them. The sky's the limit. Do what you want. And things got even better in 2011 because people thought they were going to ban the Saiga as not a sporting firearm. And it went under review by the ATF. But when they came back, it was actually good news for once. And it had not just affected this gun, but pretty much all self-loading semi-automatic shotguns. So we were actually able to get even more correct Saiga 12s. The ATF determined not only was the Saiga 12 and other similar mag-fed semi-automatic shotguns and 12-gauge legal in sporting, but actually having a pistol grip was a sporting feature. So you started to see Saigas coming in with factory stocks and pistol grips, meaning that if you get an 8-round mag and slapped it in there, you had essentially what Russian police and special forces, Spetsnaz even, were being issued. And they're just a lot cooler, and you didn't have to worry about converting them. Shoot, this would even eventually allow for factory folding stocks, although not many actually came in. Now, when Izhmash introduced the Saiga 12 around 1997, they were mostly targeting the sporting market, 3-gun competition, hunting, but police and law enforcement and military users weren't disregarded, especially like private security, and they quickly became interested. Having the Kalashnikov action system was very familiar to Russians. It was reliable for a semi-automatic mag-fed gun. So they ended up making several versions, the 12S, the 12K, with fixed or folding stocks, and issuing them with 8-round mags, and it's a combat-proven gun. It's a special type gun, and there are lots of types in service, but it was pretty successful. So when you get down to it, really the only real difference is the barrel length. In Russia, most of your military guns would be the 12K, which had a 430 millimeter barrel, not counting any attachments, which is just under 17 inches. Well, U.S. law requires at least 18 inches plus on a shotgun barrel. Yes, 16 for rifle, but 18 for shotgun. So the guns we received had essentially a 19-inch barrel. So about 2 inches extended to meet our regulations. Good news is they came in threaded, even from the beginning. And the reason they were able to get away with threading, it wasn't sold as something done for attaching these, but something done for attaching chokes, which is relevant, it's true. It just happens to mean that flash hiders, like this one, or muzzle brakes, or even sound suppressors, can go onto the factory threads. This is a chrome line bore, too. 2-position regulator. Pretty cool beans. And again, there are several styles. There's not a standard Saiga in military service. There's even some with mag wells, so on and so forth. But this really made the gun popular. And if you noticed on this, of course, I'm sure you watch my channel, you know, this, sorry, it's hard to do one-handed. That's what she said. Is actually a FIME Group Las Vegas import. And that gets us kind of the next chapter in the story. And so with that, let's return to the rifles. As 2008 came to be, like I said, EAA and RAA were the names. But Arsenal, who'd been expanding already into the stamped Bulgarian line, would become a player. And I remember when they first appeared because I was in Russia at the time and kind of looking overseas at what was going on over here. And just to mix things up, I bet you thought I was going to bring out my SGL 31. But just to make things different, let's bring out the KUSA KR 103. The first Arsenals released that weren't just like standard Saigas were half conversions, known as the SGL 10. These had a standard rear, Monte Carlo stock, but they had some work done on the front. Now, some Saigas already started coming in with standard handguards. There was no reason they couldn't have these. But even then, they couldn't have the 24 mil threads and bayonet lug. So what Arsenal was doing, They had standard handguards, standard looking gas tube. As best I can recall, they had a cleaning rod under the barrel. I could be wrong on that. It's been a few years, guys. But the big deal was they put on a 24 mil front sight base with bayonet lug. And as best I can remember, they actually weren't using AK 100 series, AK 103, AK 74M. They were actually using Bulgarian. And you can tell that because of the collar. The Russian devices have a long collar in here for a little better stability. And they look a little different on the lightning cuts. Either way, that was pretty cool. And the best I can recall, too, they were remanufactured to take standard mags. But again, I could be misremembering because the SGL-10 was very short-lived. Already by the end of 2008, the SGL-20 came out. And that was the first one from Arsenal that had a pistol grip and a standard buttstock in the rear. Now, one misconception about the SGL-20s, most at the time especially thought that they came in with the trigger in the rear and it was moved forward by Arsenal during the conversion process. And some importers like Century would do that. But if you did, you would have these holes left over. Now, you could weld them up. That would be really hard to do on stamped receivers, especially 1mm. Most just use plugs like rivets. Looked fine. The SGL-20s, though, like this one, had no leftover holes here. That's because they actually came into the country with the trigger group in the standard position and a skeletonized thumbhole buttstock. Now, if you look on Izhmash's website at the time, they had a Saiga with that style of stock. Heck, they even had Saigas with pistol grips over there, but they couldn't import them because of the 89 restrictions in America. So the deal was, instead, that they would just not have the Monte Carlo stock in the rear trigger group. The SGLs would have it in the front in a thumbhole stock. And that's because they were coming out of the, quote, Legion custom shop in Russia. Now, this was fine and allowed them to come in. Otherwise, they still had the limited mag well, and they had the neutered front end. And already by the beginning of 2009, you would see the SGL-21. And the only real differences were it had the accessory lug back here, whereas the SGL-20 didn't. And the SGL-21 actually used a true Russian front sight base instead of a Bulgarian, like the SGL-20. And most SGL-21s and 20s were actually shipped with a short 10-round mag, but they could take standard 30s. If I remember correctly, the black ones came with the 10, and the plum and green ones, I think there was the other color, had a 30 round in them. They also cost a little more. Funny thing, too, is the black ones had a AK-74 style break, and the plum one I got just had a muzzle nut on the 24 mil threads, which is kind of weird. And these are all still fixed stock guns as we get into 2009. And this would be under the Arsenal Incorporated brand name. And RAA would continue to import. I think by this point EAA has dropped out, 2008, 2009. And this is really what brought the rifle in. And the Saigas, the SGLs, they started off a little pricey, about $900 from Arsenal. But that was also around the election and right after 08, 09. By the fall of 2009, the market had plummeted. After the peak, there's always a valley. And KVAR, retail, not dealer, had the AK stimulus plan. I remember it very clearly. They had the SGL-21 brand new for $499 retail. Dealer was about $450. They even had the SGL-410, which was a pistol-gripped 410 shotgun. Yeah, those are still coming in. And they were around $459, with dealer around $420. And they really made a name for themselves. Pretty cool. With no better place to mention it, I will say that even though early on with the Saiga imports there were no really additional rules on Russian guns versus other nations in America, 93, 94, by 95 there was a bilateral agreement, a treaty, where Russia said they would not export military hardware, military-style weapons for sale on the U.S. civilian market. This is why things like the SVT-40 disappeared, SKS, what have you, even the Makarov pistol. And this put severe restrictions on what Russian guns could come in after the point. So we had the assault weapons ban, plus we had added restrictions from the import ban, plus we had added restrictions from the Russian export agreement and Russia's own laws. That's why early on, Saigas looked like this. This is the closest they could really do, but they pushed and pushed, and eventually we got the SGL 10, 20, and 21. So Arsenal has to be credited with seeing just how much they could get away with. On the other hand, the Russian Federation wasn't the same in 2008, 29 as they were back in 94, 95. And as I mentioned, Izhmash was hurting for cash. So amazing what people will do for money. And because of that, because of the desperation and the changing attitudes, ironically, is political situation cooled between America and Russia. For a time, it actually helped the firearms thing because Russia was no longer all that interested in strictly adhering to the rules and regulations because it was all up to interpretation. And this is kind of the heyday. And we've talked about calibers and whatnot. 2009, one more caliber joins the mix. Okay, I promise I really wasn't going to bring it out for this video, but I just couldn't tell the story and not my SGL 31. Because in 2009, 545 hit. And originally it started off as a sporter like this. And the reason it was, after the 2008 election, 556 ammo was hard to get in America. But surplus 545 by 39 and even newly made stuff was prevalent. It was kind of a substitute small diameter, high velocity round for America for a year or two there. And it was so in groove that AR-15 manufacturers started making uppers for 545. Heck, Smith & Wesson made an M&P in 545. So it was only logical for Russian Saigas in 545 to come over. They'd been available in Russia for quite some time, but no one had brought them over here because the cartridge just wasn't that well known or popular. But it was. And so we would get the Saiga in 545, followed very closely in 2009 by the SGL 31 in 545 with the same treatment. But there was one funny thing about the 545 gun, specifically the magwell, the magazines. Here is a Russian 545 10-round mag. I was actually going to pull out a Russian 30-round, but I ran across a Polish first. We're going to go with that. Notice something, maybe? If I'm not capturing it clearly on camera, let me explain. The 545 guns did not have a modified mag catch. It wasn't higher, meaning that a standard latch would go in. Now the fronts were still a little different. Standard here. But that's okay, because this being larger did not prevent this from going in. My point is the 545 guns, even though they shipped with 10-round mags, and they did have the kind of guide built in, a regular mag would snap in to even a Sporter or Hunter Saiga in 545. So you were just missing the feed guide. And what's even more interesting, because of the slimmer, slightly longer projectile of 545 versus 7.62, most of the time you could get away running 30-round mags in the Sporter with reliability. You still would want to put in a bullet guide, but it's like they just were in such a hurry to get these over here, they didn't put much effort into making them comply with actually the 98 mag limit that Clinton installed into the 89 ban. I find that very interesting. But of course, guns like the Saiga would still have a bullet guide installed because Arsenal was going to do things the right way. U.S. shooters wanted 5.45 guns for the ammo. U.S. collectors wanted an AK-74. And by 2010, thanks to Arsenal, we were almost there. Bayonet lug, accessory lug, 24mm threads, standard mags, standard handguards. We had one feature missing. Had the pistol grip, but we had fixed stocks, which didn't bug most people. That's why most of the guns, the SGL 21s and 31s, were the 61 or later 68 variant with the fixed stock. But for those weirdos like me, we wanted that side folder. Then, in late summer of 2010, Arsenal gave us, the collectors, what we've been asking for. The SGL 3194 with a true AK-74M. And that means it does have the 5.5 hinge, the correct rear angle, folding stock. The only thing it doesn't have is the pistol grip reinforcement, which ironically the KUSA gun does have. That's mostly the side folder they made. They did do a small number of SGL 2194s, like this one here, and 7.62x39, so AK 103s. And I looked at my logbook just to see. The first time I logged in an SGL 3194, not this one, but a different one, was November 2010. So they hit the market. And I remember, by that point, the AK stimulus plan was over, so the regular SGLs were $600-700. The 5.45s were always a little more than the 7.62s just because of economy of scale. But the side folders were retailing for around $1,100, and a lot of people weren't happy with that. Why do I want to pay $300-400 more just to get a folding stock? You either got it or you didn't. But of course, the standard Saigas were definitely still coming in too. Arsenal had the Legion shop contract lockdown. That's why their guns have the L in the serial. Other importers would still do the standard Saiga. In 2011, RWC, Russian Weapons Company, opened. Now, some seem to say that RWC or even Kalashnikov USA imported Saigas back even in the 90s. All I can tell you is, according to the RWC website, they were founded in 2011. So, anyway, they were declared the exclusive importer of the standard Saiga in 2012, and they made a big deal out of it. And they imported a lot of them. And that would kind of last to the end, if I'm being honest with you. Like I said, by July of 2014, we had sanctions. And that actually would lead to the whole Kalashnikov USA situation and the U.S. manufactured guns, which is a story outside of the purview of this video. Jumping back to the shotgun, Arsenal would import theirs as the SGL 12. The 1201 would have a Russian pistol grip after 2011. They introduced it, I think, in 2012, and the standard Russian stock. Then they would do like the SGO 120708, which had some conversion work done, kind of a different forend, that kind of thing. Only at the end would this version appear, the SGL 1294. And by this time, the Arsenal name was gone. In 2013, FIME Group became the importer instead of Arsenal. Now, they're all kind of owned by the same group. In fact, Arsenal's under FIME Group. It was a political and business decision to switch names. Still Las Vegas. Some claim the Arsenal imports were a little nicer, but you hear this all the time. I think it was just economy of scale. FIME imported more. They came in a slightly less cool box to some. I actually like the FIME box more. Either way, yeah. I mean, I've even heard that the original EAA imports were nicer than the later RAA and RWCs. And that, again, I think it's just economy of scale. They were producing fewer of them. They got more of a hurry after 2008. It happens. And again, the rejection rate was very, very low, especially for the rifles. A little more on the shotguns. There were the whole, improperly drilled gas ports. There were some that didn't have the receiver rail around 2011, 2012. Either way. By 2013, you had RWC bringing the standard in, and you had FIME Group bringing the SGL series in. And the last guns, they would come in June, July of that year. If they had an open contract and they were already en route, it wasn't like with the Chinese sanctions where everything was blocked regardless. They at least let the guns that are already bought and paid for come in and do their thing. Nevertheless, over the next couple of years, SGLs and Saigas became rarer and rarer and rarer, and thus more and more expensive. And sadly, they transitioned from being shooter guns and good fun project conversion guns into collectible guns. And that kind of gets us back to the beginning. Over in Russia, as I mentioned, 2008, they were having some financial difficulties. There would be new management, new ownership. And then in 2013, we would get Kalashnikov Concern. This would be the joining of Izhmash and Izhmash, the two Izhevsk factories, into one, as well as some other smaller subsidiaries. New management, especially, would come in 2014. And of course, there would be the war in Crimea. Funding would come in. It's a thing. And then we had the sanctions. Yeah. So that's why the Izhmash name would give way to Kalashnikov Concern, excuse me. But I will say that, as far as I know, the Izhmash name is still used as a sub-brand for the sporting line, at least some of the time. Then again, exporting these has become much harder because the U.S. is not the only nation that sanctioned Russia. Pretty much everywhere did. And those that didn't, like, say, China, they're not buying guns for the civilian market, which actually forced the company to turn more to military users, select fire, and other export customers. So that's it. But it was a good run, guys. In the 80s, even 90s, we never thought we would get Russian AKs of any stripe. Yes, like I said, Big Bear, B West, a few others brought these over in the 90s, but I never saw them. They weren't widely spread. EAA brought them into the stores and put them on shelves. And I remember just walking into my local gun shop, and there was this gun, okay, not this exact serial number, but this type, an early EAA import, 2000, this is a 2003, I probably saw a 2002, okay. But either way, it's like, okay, it's funky looking, it takes weird mags, but it's Russian. That was a big deal. And it just kept on being a big deal with the SGL series from Arsenal. And RWC kept the straight versions going if you wanted to do your own conversion, or you lived in a band state where a high cap mag and a pistol grip were not a good idea anyway. So, you had that. So even though they came in the 90s, the numbers are very small. The real run was from about 2002 to the middle of 2014. So over a decade, guys. That's longer than China, which the Chinese guns were about 83 to 89 pre-ban, and then April of 94 post-ban. So just slightly longer than China. Now, more Chinese probably came in because huge factories, but not a small number of Russians did as well. These were well enough made for the money, reliable, dependable. There were a lot of possibilities, and they were original. I think we realized we were very lucky to get the Saiga, and exceedingly lucky to get the SGL. And we knew it was only a matter of time before something threw a spanner in the works. Be it in the US, Russia, elsewhere, who knows? It kind of gets into it was good while we had it, while it lasted. And frankly, More came in than I would have predicted. The prices got lower, even with the SGLs, than I would have predicted. And in some ways, it soldiers on today with Kalashnikov USA. It's not the same, I know, but it's better than nothing. And frankly, it's better than a parts kit build, in my opinion. Unfortunately, we never did get the Saiga 9, the 9mm Saiga. And the Tiger never returned the SVD, although there had been efforts, even including from Arsenal. But we got a majority of the product line. And this is where it rounded out, guys. So what do you think? It's been a decade now, and the Saiga has gone from a run-of-the-mill shooter that just about any AK owner could afford to something reaching through legendary into mythical status, and it wasn't. These were guns made mass production in a factory. And you would have canted sights and canted gas blocks, just like with a Wasser, even if the finish was a little nicer. But that's okay. If you're looking to buy a Saiga, I'm not saying don't get one. Get one if you can. Don't go crazy on the price point, though. Realize what it is and what it isn't. I would say the same thing for Chinese Mac 90s today. Know what you are and aren't getting. Personally, I do think the Saiga 12 is pretty cool. But there's also the Vepr 12. We didn't touch on Veprs except just a very tiny bit in this video. They're their own story with Molad. And actually, importation of those would continue for 3 years more until 2017 when they too were sanctioned. But again, story for another video, another day. But yeah, as we have the 10-year anniversary of this whole situation beginning back in 2014, and since I had a couple of unconverted, mostly completely untouched come in, why not? They are fun just to shoot as is too, not gonna lie. But what do you think? Do you own one? Have you converted one? Did you buy an Arsenal like me instead of worrying about converting? I'm going to be honest, when you could get the Arsenals cheap enough in 2009, 2010, I think it was actually cheaper to get those than do your own conversion, unless you had something special in mind. But yeah, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. Also help out on Patreon. We'll be back out at the range quite soon. Just taking a downtime. Like I said, I was sick recently and getting over that now. So we'll be back out, and spring's around the corner. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.